The Royal Dutch Shell, a subsidiary of Shell, was granted a license to explore for oil in Nigeria, marking the beginning of an era that would profoundly shape the country's economic landscape. However, it wasn't until 1956 that Shell discovered oil in commercial quantities at Oloibiri, a village in the Niger Delta. As you would know, this discovery was a pivotal moment, transforming Nigeria into a key player in the global oil industry. And by 1958, Nigeria had joined the ranks of oil-exporting nations, with Shell leading the charge. The oil boom brought significant revenue to Nigeria, with oil quickly becoming the backbone of the national economy. It was then accounted at over 90% of the country's export earnings and a substantial portion of its GDP. But unfortunately, while the Nigerian government and international oil companies reaped immense profits, the local communities in the Niger Delta, where most of the oil extraction took place, saw little benefits. Instead, they bore the brunt of the environmental degradation and social disruptions caused by the industry. The Niger Delta, an ecologically area rich with diverse flora and fauna, has been severely impacted by the oil industry, suffering frequent oil spills, gas flaring, and pollution, all of which have had devastating consequences. Take, for instance, oil spills have been a constant issue in the Niger Delta, with Shell being one of the major contributors. These spills, often caused by pipeline corrosion, operational failures, and occasionally sabotage, have led to widespread environmental destruction. In 2008, the Bodo community experienced not one, but two catastrophic oil spills, which polluted waterways and destroyed livelihoods based on fishing and agriculture. The spills left a lasting legacy of pollution, with crude oil seeping into the soil and water, rendering them toxic. Of course, another major environmental issue has been gas flaring, burning off excess natural gas during oil extraction. On the downside, this process releases a cocktail of harmful chemicals into the atmosphere, contributing to air pollution and posing severe health risks to local communities. The flaring has also been a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to global climate change. But regardless of this, local communities have faced repression and violence as they have tried to protest against environmental damages, demanding better compensation and living conditions. One of the most notable cases of resistance was led by the Ogoni people in the 1950s. Eventually, Shell began extracting oil in Ogoniland, and over the course of time, this led to severe pollution, damaging farmland, and rivers, of course, hurting the Ogoni people's way of life. So, what did they do? In 1990, they formed a group called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP. Led by Ken Saro-Wiwa, MOSOP demanded that Shell clean up the pollution, share the oil money fairly, and respect their rights. Also stating their claims in regard to oil spills and gas flaring causing massive environmental damage. Spilled oil polluting the land and water, making farming and fishing difficult. And the toxic exposure of gas flaring, polluting the air and causing health problems for the people. A report by the United Nations in 2011 showed how bad the pollution was. It found that the soil and water in Ogoniland were heavily contaminated, and cleaning it up would take many years and cost a lot of money. But in return, the Nigerian government and Shell did not respond well to MOSOP's demands. Instead of addressing the issues, they tried to silence the Ogoni people. The Nigerian military government saw MOSOP's activism as a threat. They arrested, tortured, and even killed people to stop the protests. The worst incident was in 1995, when Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 other Ogoni leaders were executed after a trial that many believed was partial and unfair, which led to an international outrage and Nigeria's temporary suspension from the Commonwealth. The execution of the Ogoni 9 brought global attention to their struggle. Many human rights and environmental groups supported the Ogoni cause, and some countries imposed sanctions on Nigeria. In 2009, Shell agreed to pay $15.5 million to settle a lawsuit in the United States brought by the families of the executed Ogoni leaders. This settlement was seen as a small step towards justice, even though Shell did not admit wrongdoing. However, the cleanup of Ogoni land was very slow. The Nigerian government's efforts to clean up the area, guided by the UNEP report, faced many problems, including delays and lack of transparency. The Ogoni crisis was an eye-opener to the larger problems in the Niger Delta, ranging from severe pollution to corporate negligence, and ultimately the government's failure to protect its people. For Ogoniland to recover, there had to be a serious and strict efforts to clean up the pollution, compensate those affected, and ensure that oil extraction was done responsibly. Stronger laws, better enforcement, and real commitment from both the government and oil companies were to be implemented. The 2011 United Nations Environmental Programme (UNEP) report called for an urgent and comprehensive cleanup of the region, estimating it would take up to 30 years and cost around $1 billion. Despite these recommendations, the actual cleanup efforts were marred by delays and inadequate action. In response to the UNEP report, the Nigerian government established the Hydrocarbon Pollution Restoration Project, HYPREP, to oversee the cleanup of Ogoniland. However, HYPREP's efforts were criticised for being slow and lacking transparency. Initial funding and operational challenges hampered effective action, leaving many affected areas still heavily polluted. The Ogoni people and their advocates continued to press for justice and environmental restoration through various advocacy channels. There were additional lawsuits and campaigns aimed at Shell and the Nigerian government, holding them accountable. Several other lawsuits were also filed against Shell in various jurisdictions, including the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, seeking compensation for environmental damage and human rights abuses. While some of these cases resulted in settlements or favourable rulings for the plaintiffs, others were still ongoing, reflecting the protracted nature of legal battles in this context. International organisations and advocacy groups kept the Ogoni crisis in the global spotlight. They campaigned tirelessly to ensure Shell and the Nigerian government honoured their commitments to environmental remediation and community compensation. These efforts were crucial in maintaining pressure on all parties involved to take meaningful action. Local communities in Ogoniland played a vital role in driving the cleanup efforts and advocating for their rights. Grassroots organisations and community leaders worked closely with international allies to monitor progress and push for transparency in the cleanup process. Their involvement was indeed critical in ensuring that the voices of those directly affected were heard and considered in decision-making processes. Over time, the cleanup efforts in Ogoniland began to gain momentum. HYPREP, under renewed scrutiny and pressure, started to implement more concrete measures to address the environmental damage. This included conducting detailed assessments of contaminated sites and initiating remediation activities to restore the environment, implement projects to provide clean drinking water, and improve healthcare facilities for affected communities, developing programs to support the restoration of livelihoods for those who had lost their means of income due to pollution in the decision-making processes related to the cleanup. Further pushing for the inclusion of local experts and community leaders in HYPREP's planning and implementation stages to ensure that the cleanup efforts were aligned with the needs and priorities of the affected communities. As HYPREP's work progressed, reactions from the Indigenous communities remained unsettling. Many felt that it was still insufficient and too slow. There were, of course, instances where local communities acknowledged the efforts made by HYPREP, especially when tangible results were seen. For example, when initial cleanup activities commenced and certain contaminated sites showed signs of improvement, it provided a glimmer of hope that the project might eventually succeed. However, many community members continued to criticise the pace and scope of HYPREP's work. They argued that the cleanup was not comprehensive enough and that many areas remained polluted. There were also ongoing concerns about the health impacts of the pollution and the need for better healthcare facilities and services. But despite all these measures taken, significant challenges remained. But without a doubt, the settlement of Shell's lawsuit marked a key moment in the Ogoni people's struggle for justice. It was the subsequent actions, driven by persistent legal, advocacy and community efforts, that began to address the deep-rooted environmental and social issues in Ogoniland. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to see more of what we have in store for you.